Stop me if you heard this one before. Politics has become so bad these days with all this polarization. Politics are so polarized. When I was a lad, everyone had the exact same political opinions, and we were fine with that. Everything was good. Hell was I doing with my hands? But you see, here's the problem. That's not necessarily true. Politics, by their very nature, are going to be polarizing. And the times when they weren't were not great times in world history, especially American history, where I have most expertise. There are some fairly reasonable explanations as to why that I'm going to go into in this video that I'm making right now. So let's look into political polarization, find out why things are the way they are. Hi, I'm soy-fueled deep fryer drinking bitch boy, and this is Tristan Won't Shut Up. For the people who still watch TV, you might be curious as to what people are talking about when they're talking about politics being polarized and the discourse breaking down. I think before we can break down the concept of polarization within politics, we should probably have a conversation about what is politics. You'd think that the definition of politics goes without saying, but a lot of the liberal political narratives built up around politics have given a completely wrong understanding of what it means. Right now, if I were to say what is politics, a lot of people would think that it is essentially the pageantry of discussing what our rulers do and what kind of decisions they make, and the very few times that we get input into what they do. There's teams, there's elections, people win and lose, you know, the sport match. What politics really means is it is the fight over who does and does not have power, and what the society that we live in should look like. And what makes politics difficult to talk about in our current society is that all mediated conversations about it in mass media, i.e., television, mainstream podcasts, news that you hear on the radio, all of the common ways that most adults get their news information outside of like the internet, which is a topic we're going to cover later, talks about things through a liberal lens. And what is liberal politics? If we want to go super Marxist on it, liberalism is essentially the political class interests of those who are the owners of corporations and the owners of companies. Essentially, people who make money not by working, but by having other people do work for them and exploiting their labor for profit. People in this class tend to do very well for themselves, and so a lot of the things that are debated in political discussions are theoretical, academic, and not so much a matter of life and death for those making said decisions. The stakes are very, very low for the class that controls most of the organs of discussing politics and running politics in capitalist countries. No matter who gets elected, no matter how bad things get, they personally will be fine. People will be starving in the streets and they'll still have plenty of ice cream in their freezer, so really all of this stuff is just academic, theoretical, nice to haves. And because the stakes are so low and everything is seen as just sort of a matter of course, doing your job, not really going to make a big difference either way, the liberal class tends to assume that things like decorum and civility are much more important than they actually are, because they don't see debates about, say, healthcare policy as a fight for life or death, like someone, say, who has to ration their insulin. And that's the real problem with the disconnection between the politics that we see on television, the horse race, the tearing sheets, the speeches, and politics as it's experienced on the ground. Politics, in many ways, is the decision about who lives and who dies. If healthcare remains private, people die. If civil society breaks apart and things like food stamps and subsidies for housing go away, people die. The fascists get elected, people die. But because liberals have all the money, and because liberals run all of the major media organs, their interests are the ones that are discussed. Their idea of politics reigns supreme. So when those liberals are complaining about polarization, what are they actually complaining about? What they're mostly complaining about is that on the ground, many people are starting to notice the way that politics are affecting their lives. The wealth of a lot of people is starting to diminish, and they're mad about it. What's going on is that people on the ground are starting to see through this facade. People's material conditions are starting to change. This is probably all stuff you've heard before, but people are working longer hours for lower wages. We're in the middle of a huge economic catastrophe in which a lot of people are going unemployed. And in many ways, when we have an economic system based on your right to live contingent on having a job, that's bad. We're now in our 5th decade of steadily increasing income inequality. And over time, the buying power for the vast majority of people in the world has been decreasing. Now we have 3 generations that have experienced nothing but a long decline in their ability to live the lives of their forefathers. Basically, faith in liberal capitalism is failing. Some are seeing the conditions on the ground and analyzing them for what they are and looking at what kind of systemic problems are leading to the problems we have today, realizing that the problem is capitalism, and are becoming socialists, which, to a liberal media class person would be a part of the radical left. Some people are not taking such a route and instead are trying to scapegoat any minority group that they can blame for the problems of capitalism and are becoming fascists, i.e. the radical right. And this has happened multiple times in history because capitalism is a very unstable system. In the Great Depression, there was great political polarization. People were getting into socialism, people were getting into fascism, because their faith in the structures that were holding together society were shaken by the fact that it had just over millions of people, and tons of people lost their livelihoods and were barely scraping to get by. In my previous video on the assassination of William McKinley, the Panic of 1893 also caused great unemployment and caused the rise of a vast left-wing socialist movement, i.e. the populists or the People's Party, but also activated a lot of socialists, communists, and anarchists to get more into active left-wing activism. And you can trace the beginning of these problems to the 1970s about. And what happened in the 1970s that would make income equality start to increase and everyone's general standard of living go down? The answer to that, my friends, is neoliberalism. What happened is that in the mid-70s there was another economic crisis. And in times of crisis, very often great political mobilization and change can happen because countries are trying to find anything that they can to fix the problems of what's going on. And in that situation, neoliberalism, this idea of free market fundamentalism that had been rising with the Chicago boys, the economists over at the University of Chicago, had become very mainstream through papers and books and conferences and television appearances. They had done conscious work to bring their ideas into the mainstream. So, when there was an economic catastrophe, what did that society do but take the idea that was lying around and say, hey, why don't we use this to fix things? You can read about a discussion on how these crises change societies in a book called The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. And so what happened is a lot of these free market fundamentalists on the far right began to rise to prominent places in American politics, but also around the world. In America, the example I know because of my, history and expertise and stuff like that, Ronald Reagan would probably be the first real buyer of this idea in the Republican Party, and Bill Clinton would probably be the first Democrat who had this idea really baked into their consciousness. But this idea had been bubbling to the top in many capitalist countries, either the same way as it did in the United States with, various different soft power measures, or because the US government didn't like what government they had, and so they, did a right-wing coup and put in a dictator, like what happened in Chile. And also, organizations like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund would often go to help fledgling economies get out of issues caused by colonization and such, but have the string attached that in order to get the money and resources they need to get off the ground, they have to implement a whole bunch of neoliberal reforms. And neoliberalism makes it sound like it's a new and forward-thinking idea, but what it really is neoclassical liberalism. And classical liberalism was the reigning political ideology of the late 19th, early 20th century, where the economy had no stopgaps to protect itself from huge negative feedback loops, and a lot of people worked completely inhumane amounts of hours in very dangerous conditions for less than they needed to survive. The age when children worked in factories and people worked 6 days a week, often for 14 hours a day. This was a time when there was very few regulations for safety or for health, so Bread with arsenic in it or filled with sawdust was regular. Medications could sell you basically whatever the they wanted. And food was a bit of a gamble over whether or not you'd get some sort of horrible, horrible poisoning. So, this is the period that neoliberals want to go back to ultimately. Under neoliberal regimes, labor's power, i.e. organized unions, was very undermined and largely destroyed, especially in the United States. What this did effectively was give working people virtually no say in the conditions that they experience in the workplace. And the workplace, if you think about it as a domain of your life, affects a lot of your livelihood and the quality of your existence and that of your family. For you to basically have no say in something that has such a massive part of your life is a huge retraction of the democratic process. So without unions, there's virtually no political power and even less democracy than there was in the workplace. What this resulted in is an increasing in the productivity of people, so i.e. people started working longer hours and working harder, but the amount of money that they were taking home started to stagnate. And if you factor in inflation, started to go down. And to channel the anger that was brought about by, everyone's lives just getting a little bit shittier every day, for Black people never really being great in the first place, and channel that anger towards scapegoats, illegal immigration, just Black people in general existing, and whatever other group they could find to really pin all of the world's problems on. And despite attempts by progressive-leaning liberals, the system is basically irredeemable. Capitalism is an inherently flawed and fragile structure. There's this internal tension where those who own all of the factories, all of the companies, have this need to keep costs down to maximize profits. Therefore, they need to try and cut costs wherever possible, and they need to try and pay their employees as little as they can get away with. The problem with that part, though, is that capitalist economies also require to function a consumer base that has money that they can then spend on the goods that those companies are selling. So there's always this internal contradiction, this complete irreconcilable difference between this urge to pay people as low as possible and people needing to have money in order to have the right to live, basically, in capitalism. And with financialization, capitalist economies' growth are tied to these positive and negative feedback cycles. You've probably heard them as economic booms and busts, or bubbles and depressions, or things like that. And so when things were good, but they were even better for the rich. And when things were bad, they were really bad and not as bad for the same rich people. And this was even worse when there were no controls on the economy. During the Depression, FDR passed a law called Glass-Steagall, which meant that investment banks that, invest on the stock market and personal banks that held your own wealth could not be the same company. You couldn't do both, which was repealed in 1998 under the Clinton administration. And guess how that turned out? And it's also important to keep in mind that the people who suffer the downturns of capitalism the worst are those who, under a Marxist lens, would say are hyper-exploited, which means that because of fractures in the social fabric of society, bosses can typically get away with paying them and treating them even worse than, say, their more privileged counterparts. So this means people of color, this means women, this means LGBTQ+ people. Those people can be discriminated in the workplace, not through direct means, but for the most part, it means that they will suffer economic downturns worse. The example I always like to point to is that the 2008 recession hit a lot of people pretty hard, but it especially hurt the Black community of the United States. Their wealth was already meager compared to white people, but it has been in a sharp downward trend since the housing bubble burst because there was no recovery for them. There was no bailout for Black people. And it's expected that by 2050, the net amount of wealth for Black people in the United States will be zero. So if capitalism is so unstable and liberalism being basically the stewardship of the capitalist system, how did it last so long? Why is it in 2020, when capitalism's been going for centuries, that now we're having this discussion? Well, the first thing I gotta say is that we've never not been having this conversation. The entire Cold War was about this conversation. A lot of labor history was about this conversation. There's been a non-stop struggle about this conversation basically since capitalism began. But liberal leaders at least used to be pretty savvy. and they knew that without a little bit of bread and circuses, the people would riot. And so they had a lot of what are, called social democratic programs put in place in order to make sure that people were kept just well off enough that they weren't in desperate enough straits to basically start to rise up and revolt against the government. During the crisis of capitalism called the Great Depression, in the United States, for example, Franklin Roosevelt put in a lot of programs to try and help people and give them just enough so that they're not rioting. FDR literally claimed that by putting in these New Deal programs, he was trying to save capitalism. This was stuff like, for example, Social Security. One of the things that was explicitly done during the New Deal was this work guarantee program that would take young men out of cities and put them into places like national parks to do busy work in order to keep them employed. And that was explicitly done because they knew that if those young men were unemployed, they would start getting into radical politics and they might start, talking about overthrowing the government. I would also say that Lyndon B. Johnson did a very similar thing. And in America, things like Medicare and Medicaid and welfare programs are some of the few things that are keeping a lot of people in the United States just clinging on to a material existence, and without it, there would be riots in the streets. There are riots in the streets. This is why cutting back on all these things has caused so much instability. A lot of the ideas they used to try and do this were basically just looking at what Sweden or the USSR were doing and just kind of copying down their notes and rebranding them as something that's pro-capitalist. And the USSR was doing the same, so don't worry.
Both sides.
But it reminds me a lot about how Saudi Arabia has kept itself so stable because it's just so rich in oil that despite the fact that the people in the country have no democracy whatsoever, they get basically a cradle-to-grave welfare state and sometimes negative taxes. The government just gives them money. So essentially, what people are calling the polarization of politics is really just a return to real politics, as the life support systems of the liberal state are being dissolved by neoliberal cutbacks. And it seems that neoliberals are ideologically completely incapable of making the necessary changes in order to preserve their society. Essentially, the center can't hold. And politics right now is about deciding what comes after. And I can imagine that right now you're furiously writing a comment about something to do with filter bubbles or social media, something to do with how the internet is the real cause of polarization. And what I have to say is no, but also kinda. I do somewhat have some expertise in the history of technology, the history of communications, and actually studied the development of online cultures and the building of the communication networks of the internet. So I'm definitely going to get into it next week. Thank you everybody for watching. If you want to make sure to get that video next week, please subscribe and hit the bell notification so that you won't miss it. And of course, thank you to all my patrons who went to patreon.com/stepbackhistory and made this video done. Anyways, I'll see you all next week. Ciao. Hi, I'm Soy Fuel Deep Diver. Hi, I'm Soy Fuel Deep Fryer Drinking Bitch Boy. Wow, okay.